The bedbug is 5 millimeters long, and it has been in this room longer than the current guests. It is in the seam, the exact fold where the fabric of the mattress meets the piping along its edge, in the narrow channel of darkness that runs the full length of the bed and stays the same temperature, regardless of what season the city outside is moving through, because the mattress traps warmth from every body that has ever lain on it. The bug has not moved in 11 days. It does not need to move. Moving is a risk this organism takes only when hunger makes the risk unavoidable, and it is not hungry yet. So it waits in the seam with the patience of something that has been doing exactly this for longer than recorded history, in structures very different from this one, and in structures nearly identical to it, and it waits for the one thing it knows will always come. The light goes off. The breathing changes. The heat rises from the body in the bed in the specific pattern that means a large, warm-blooded animal has entered the prolonged stillness of deep sleep, and the bedbug, registering this information through the heat sensors distributed across the flat surface of its body, begins to move toward it. It moves along the interior of the seam, then out onto the underside of the mattress fabric, then across the surface toward the warmth source in the way it has always moved. Steadily, without hesitation, without the erratic searching behavior of an organism navigating toward something unfamiliar. This is not unfamiliar. Nothing about this is unfamiliar. The bug has been doing this, or organisms exactly like it have been doing this, since before this hotel chain existed, since before hotel chains existed as a concept, since before most of what exists in this room existed in any form. It does not hurry. It has never needed to hurry. Its saliva contains an anesthetic compound that takes effect within seconds of entering the skin, so precisely calibrated by millions of years of selection pressure that the sleeping person above it will feel nothing, not the faintest pressure of contact, not the lightest awareness of anything touching the surface of their skin. The feeding takes several minutes. The bug withdraws before the body in the bed shifts toward the shallower phases of sleep. It retreats to the seam and settles into the stillness that is most of its existence. The person above it does not know. They will not know for days. When the bites appear, they will be attributed to mosquitoes first, then to a reaction to something in the hotel laundry, then to some allergy that seems to have developed without explanation. It will be a long time and a specific search before anyone uses the word that fits. This is not an accident. Nothing about Cymex lectularius is accidental. The flatness of the body, pressed so thin it can slide through a gap, narrower than the edge of a credit card with no apparent effort, did not evolve for hotel mattresses. It evolved for rock faces, for the cracks in the walls of caves, for the gap beneath a loose piece of bark on a rotting tree, where the ancestors of modern humans were sleeping nearby, and the ancestors of this bug were waiting above them in the dark, running the same calculation this bug is running tonight, waiting for the same heat signature, delivering the same anesthetic, withdrawing before the same dawn. The timing of the feeding did not evolve for hotel schedules. It evolved for cave dwellers, who would have woken and killed the bug if it had fed during any lighter phase of sleep. The anesthetic saliva did not evolve to protect hotel guests from discomfort. It evolved to protect the bug from detection by people who had every reason to want it dead. These are not behaviors. They are biology. The bug does not choose them, it is them. And the relationship between this biology and the sleeping humans it has been built around is older than any human attempt to document it, older than any human institution that has ever tried to address it, older than the language in which those attempts have been written down. Genetic evidence and fossil records place the beginning of the association between Cymex lectularius and the human lineage and cave systems in the ancient world, most likely somewhere in the Middle East or northeastern Africa, where early hominids were sharing shelter with bat colonies. A close relative of the modern bedbug, the bat bug, was already established in those caves as a parasite of bats, having evolved that relationship across millions of years of shared cave habitation. As the hominid population around those caves grew, as the warm, sleeping bodies of human ancestors became an available alternative host in the same spaces the bat bugs were already occupying, a lineage shifted. As the human population dispersed outward across tens of thousands of years, as it left the caves and built its own structures out of wood and clay and stone that turned out to replicate the relevant conditions closely enough that the bug experienced them as functionally equivalent, the bug followed. It has been following ever since. By the time human civilization had developed enough complexity to produce written records, the relationship was so thoroughly established that the earliest authors mentioning bed bugs do so without any introduction, the way you mention weather. They are a fact requiring no explanation, a condition of shared human sleeping space so universal that describing it would have felt like describing air. Roman writers addressed them as an inconvenience of urban life. Medieval European texts offer various remedies in the resigned tone of people managing something that will be managed, not solved. Travelers from the 14th through the 19th century, moving through Europe and Asia and the Americas and Africa, and documenting their journeys in letters and journals and published accounts, note the bugs alongside bad roads and difficult landlords and poor food, as one of the stable frictions of being a warm-blooded animal sleeping in spaces built and used by other warm-blooded animals. They were in the inns and the army barracks and the ship's holds and the tenement buildings of every city that had tenement buildings. They were there before the building was constructed, and they would be there after the current tenants moved on, and they had, in the full span of their association with human sleeping spaces, never encountered anything that seriously threatened that continuity. Then, in the middle of the 20th century, they did. Dichlorodiphenyltrichloroethane, DDT. The compound was developed in the late 1930s and deployed at scale across the United States and Western Europe through the 1940s and into the 1950s, with an ambition that the pest control campaigns of any earlier era had never approached. The military used it in the Pacific Theater. Public health authorities used it in refugee camps and field hospitals. Residential pest control companies used it in apartment buildings and hotels across American cities as a standard treatment for a range of insect pests and found that it worked against bed bugs with an effectiveness that nothing in their previous experience had prepared them for. DDT killed on contact and persisted on treated surfaces for weeks. Spray it on a baseboard, and anything walking across that baseboard died before it reached the far wall. Spray it on a mattress, and anything living in the seam of that mattress died by contact with the surface it had always lived on. There was nowhere in a treated building where Chimex lectularius could go that was not fatal. The compound had saturated the gap. It had penetrated the seam. It was in the crack and the crevice and the space behind the baseboard and the interior of the mattress piping. For an insect whose entire survival strategy, whose entire evolutionary heritage, was built around the principle of finding the dark gap and waiting in it, the problem was that the dark gap had become lethal. Every surface the bug needed was now the thing that would kill it. The populations collapsed. Through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, infestations that had been treated as a routine feature of residential pest control work became increasingly unusual, then rare, then something that technicians with 15 years of experience were no longer regularly encountering. By the 1960s, pest control companies were not training new hires to identify bed bugs because there were not enough presenting in the field to make the training feel urgent. Medical schools were phasing the clinical presentation of bedbug bites out of curricula because the condition had become uncommon enough to seem theoretical. Parents who had grown up in urban apartments where bedbugs were an acknowledged background condition of life were raising children who encountered the word only in a nursery rhyme, a phrase whose concrete reference had evaporated from living experience within a single generation. The knowledge infrastructure that had existed because the problem existed dissolved in roughly 20 years. The bug was not gone. In isolated pockets where treatment campaigns had been incomplete, in buildings where the application had not reached every harborage site, in scattered populations across Eastern Europe and parts of Asia where the infrastructure for a systematic DDT program had not been available in the same form, small remnant populations maintained themselves, too small and too scattered to constitute any visible problem. Nobody was watching them. Nobody was monitoring what was happening inside them. What was happening inside them would take 30 years to matter. A population subjected to sustained, lethal chemical pressure and not completely eliminated is, in the surviving generation, a population that has been filtered. The individuals who died were the susceptible ones, the ones whose biology interacted with the compound in the way the compound was designed to produce a fatal outcome. The individuals who survived were the ones whose biology differed from the susceptible individuals in some way that reduced that interaction. In large enough populations, this variation is always present, not because any organism deliberately generates it, but because genetic variation is the normal condition of any reproducing population, and some of that variation will, by chance, affect susceptibility to any given chemical. Some individuals had cuticles, the waxy outer layer of the exoskeleton, through which any contact insecticide must penetrate to reach the nervous tissue, that were slightly thicker than average. The lipid composition of the cuticle varied across individuals in ways that affected how quickly pyrethroid molecules, which replaced DDT as the industry standard after the DDT ban in 1972, dissolved into and diffused through the cuticle layers. In an environment where pest control chemicals are applied repeatedly over years, the difference between a cuticle that allows penetration to lethal concentration in 2 minutes and one that slows penetration to 4 minutes determines which individual survives to reproduce and which does not. Those that survived passed the genes for cuticle thickness to offspring. The offspring that survived passed those genes further. Across generations, the population mean shifted toward the thicker end of the distribution. The same arithmetic operated on the enzyme systems inside those surviving individuals. Every insect carries gene families encoding enzymes whose function is to identify and neutralize foreign chemical compounds before those compounds can reach the cellular machinery and disrupt it. These systems are not specific to synthetic insecticides. They evolved over hundreds of millions of years of insect history as a defense against the chemical arsenal of plants, which have been producing toxic, defensive compounds against insect herbivores for far longer than insects and humans have been in conflict. They are general-purpose chemical processing infrastructure. Individuals whose versions of these enzyme systems were more active, who produced higher concentrations of the relevant proteins, who processed and excreted chemical compounds at a higher rate, survived pyrethroid exposure at higher rates. They reproduced. Their offspring inherited the enhanced processing capacity. The population's average biochemical tolerance increased generation by generation, across the decades when nobody was watching. In some of those isolated Eastern European populations specifically, a particular mutation was accumulating in the gene encoding the sodium channel protein. The sodium channel is a protein embedded in nerve cell membranes that controls the flow of ions, that generates and transmits electrical signals. Pyrethroids work by binding to this channel and holding it in an open state, triggering continuous uncontrolled nerve firing that leads to paralysis and death. The mutation changed the three-dimensional geometry of the binding site, the specific shape of the region of the protein where pyrethroid molecules were designed to fit. The change was not large, but it was enough. Pyrethroid molecules arriving at the channel found a shape that was subtly wrong, that the molecule did not settle into as firmly, that released the binding before the cascade of lethal effects that was supposed to follow. The channel continued functioning. The nerve continued operating. The insect survived. Individuals carrying this mutation, which researchers would eventually name knockdown resistance, or KDR, survived pyrethroid exposure that killed individuals without it. Across generations, it spread through the population. Alongside the biochemical resistance, a behavioral shift was being selected for simultaneously. Bedbugs, from populations with long histories of pyrethroid exposure, behaved differently in treated environments than bugs from unexposed populations. When tested in laboratory arenas with treated and untreated surfaces both available, the resistant population bugs spent measurably less time on treated surfaces. Their chemosensory systems, the same sensory apparatus the bug uses to locate warm sleeping hosts in darkness, had been calibrated by decades of selection to detect the molecular signature of pyrethroid residue and respond to that detection with avoidance. The spray was on the baseboard. The bug walked a different path no exposure occurred. No resistance mechanism was engaged. The treatment failed, not because the bug survived a lethal dose, but because the bug's behavior had evolved to prevent contact with the lethal dose in the first place. All of this was developing in populations too small and too geographically remote to attract any monitoring. The resistance was accumulating in the dark, in the decades when bed bugs were considered a solved problem, in populations that were unobserved, becoming something significantly more difficult to kill. What the return required to carry these transformed populations back into the cities and buildings of the developed world at scale was infrastructure. And through the late 1980s and accelerating dramatically through the 1990s, the world built that infrastructure with no awareness of what it was also building it for. The expansion of commercial air travel following deregulation in the United States created a sustained reduction in long-haul ticket prices that opened international travel to populations who had never previously had access to it. By the mid-1990s, the global air travel network was moving hundreds of millions of passengers annually across continents. Business travelers crossing the Atlantic weekly, tourism expanding into regions that had been economically inaccessible a decade earlier, student exchange programs, backpacker routes, labor migration corridors. The full range of reasons that human beings move between countries was operating at a frequency and geographic reach that no previous period in human history had approximated. All of those people were carrying luggage. All of them were sleeping in hotels and hostels and short-term rentals in cities connected to other cities by a network that the bug, without any awareness of what a network was now able to move through with a speed that matched human travel exactly, because it traveled inside human luggage. A bed bug in the lining of a suitcase is invisible to any inspection process that airports conduct. It requires no food for any journey a suitcase takes, because it can survive without feeding for over a year in cool conditions. It waits. It arrives where the suitcase arrives. It moves in the first night after arrival from the luggage to the nearest available gap, the seam of a mattress in a hotel room, the space behind a baseboard, in an apartment that has not seen a bed bug in 30 years and has no professional infrastructure capable of recognizing one when it arrives. A single mated female is sufficient to found a colony from nothing. The male's reproductive mechanism, a process researchers describe as traumatic insemination, involves piercing the female's abdominal wall directly and depositing sperm into her body cavity, bypassing the reproductive tract entirely. The physical damage this causes means females in established populations frequently move away after mating, carrying viable sperm to new locations where they establish independently. A single mated female arriving in a new building carries everything needed to generate a population where none existed. In warm conditions, with access to a sleeping host, she produces hundreds of offspring across her lifetime. Those offspring reach reproductive maturity in 5 to 6 weeks. The mathematics of exponential growth in a warm room with no predators and no monitoring, calibrated to the bug's presence, means that by the time an infestation becomes obvious enough that a resident notices it and contacts pest control, the population is already in the hundreds or thousands, distributed across multiple harborage sites that a single treatment visit will not reach. The first reports came from Australia in the mid-1990s. Hotel operators describing treatments that produced temporary reductions, followed by unexplained population rebounds within weeks. By the late 1990s, the same pattern was being reported from European hotel networks, and then from North American cities. By 2004, New York City's health department had logged a 10-fold increase in bed bug complaints compared to 2001. By 2010, bed bug service calls had become one of the primary revenue streams for pest control companies in major American cities, and the industries had shifted from describing the situation as an outbreak to describing it as a permanent new condition of the urban pest landscape. The genetic analysis that followed the resurgence produced a finding that the researchers involved described as genuinely surprising. The resurging North American populations were not primarily descended from the remnant American populations that had survived the DDT era. They were descended from Eastern European populations. The global travel network had not merely reintroduced a local pest, it had replaced the historical American population almost entirely with a genetically distinct, more resistant one from the other side of the world, one that had spent 30 years being selected by pyrethroids in countries where pyrethroids had been the primary pest control tool since the early 1970s. The compound was the same. The organism was not. The treatment failures that continue to define residential bed bug management in urban centers across the developed world are not failures of protocol or product quality. They are the predictable outcome of deploying a chemical class against a population whose biology has been shaped by that chemical class across 3 decades of selection pressure. The cuticle slows penetration. The enzymes neutralize what penetrates. The KDR mutation alters the target so what arrives cannot bind effectively. And before any of those mechanisms need to engage, the behavioral avoidance routes the bug around treated surfaces without contact, so that the treatment sits correctly in place, covering every surface it was supposed to cover, and the bug is traveling above the baseboard along the wall, through the gap in the treatment coverage that exists in every real structural environment. A treated apartment in a multi-unit building is surrounded by connected spaces through which bugs travel through wall voids and plumbing penetrations and shared structural infrastructure with no awareness of which lease agreement governs which side of which wall. Treating a single unit reduces that unit's population. It does not reduce the surrounding reservoir. 6 weeks later, the treated unit is recolonized from the reservoir that was never addressed. The people living inside these situations carry something that accumulates well beyond the physical. Sleep deprivation begins almost immediately, because knowing the specific thing that is happening in the dark does not coexist well with the ability to fall asleep the way sleep used to happen. The checking of sheets before getting into bed, the light on at 2 a.m, the weeks of broken rest, compounding into anxiety, compounding into a hypervigilance that researchers studying affected households have documented persisting for months and in some cases years after the infestation has been resolved. The stigma that attaches to bed bugs is old, stubborn, and entirely disconnected from how they actually spread. They infest 5-star hotels and hospitals and libraries and offices. They move through luggage and secondhand furniture and the traffic of human bodies through shared spaces. And none of that has any relationship to the cleanliness or habits of the people affected. But the cultural association adds a layer of shame to an experience already exhausting on its own terms, delays the seeking of professional help, and extends the period during which populations grow unchecked. The genome of Cymex lectularius, fully sequenced in 2016, explained part of what had been puzzling about the speed of resistance development. The detoxification gene families in the bed bug genome are larger and more diverse than equivalent families in many other sequenced insect genomes. These did not evolve to handle synthetic pyrethroids. They evolved over the tens of millions of years the bugs spent in intimate chemical contact with hosts across the full span of the human bed bug association. The infrastructure to process foreign compounds was already exceptionally well developed in this organism before synthetic insecticides existed. When pyrethroids appeared, that infrastructure needed only to be expressed at higher levels. The resistance was not created by the pesticides. The variation that produced it was already there. The pesticides found it, eliminated every individual who lacked it, and allowed the individuals who carried it to become the entire population. What researchers studying bedbug epidemiology at the building and neighborhood scale consistently identify as the most underappreciated factor in persistent urban infestations is not the resistance itself, but the detection gap that allows resistance to develop uncontested. Most infestations are not identified until the population has grown large enough to produce unmistakable evidence visible to an untrained observer. By that point, weeks or months have elapsed since the first individual arrived, and the population has established harborage sites across multiple structural locations, making any single treatment visit inadequate by definition. early detection technology, passive interception devices, and active monitors using heat and chemical attractants can identify infestations at the incipient stage when populations are still small enough that targeted treatment is genuinely effective. A population of 20 bugs concentrated in a single mattress seam is a fundamentally different problem from a population of 2,000 bugs distributed through wall voids, electrical fixtures, furniture frames, and adjacent spaces. Detection technology does not address the resistance, but it changes when in the infestation timeline treatment occurs, and that timing determines whether the response has any realistic chance of being adequate. The arms race between Cymex lectularius and human pest control is measured against the timescale of the ant fungus that has been running its own parallel arms race for 48 million years, extraordinarily recent. DDT appeared in the 1940s. Pyrethroids replaced it in the 1970s. The resistance now present in field populations across most major cities represents perhaps 70 years of selection at most. And within those 70 years, starting from the ordinary genetic variation present in whatever population survived, the bug has developed a multi-layered defense against the primary chemical class the industry deployed against it, spread that defense globally through the travel network that the human species built for entirely unrelated purposes, and re-established itself in every city from which it had been effectively eliminated, in larger numbers and with significantly greater treatment difficulty than before the elimination was attempted. In the seam of the hotel mattress tonight, the bug settling back into stillness after the feeding carries all of this in a body 5 millimeters long. The thickened cuticle, the elevated enzyme systems, the sodium channel with the geometry that is shifted just enough away from the shape the pyrethroid molecule expects, the sensory calibration that will route it around any treated surface before any of those other mechanisms ever need to engage, the ability to wait for over a year without food, the timing that brought it out at the deepest hour of sleep and will keep it in the seam through every hour of light. The seam of the mattress is still the same seam. The darkness is still the same darkness. The warmth rising from the sleeping host is the same warmth it has always been. Everything the bug needs is where it has always been. Tomorrow the guests will check out. The sheets will be changed. New guests will arrive with luggage from new cities, moving through a travel network whose scale and connectivity have never been exceeded, staying one night before moving on to somewhere else. In the seam, something that outlasted the cave and the tenement and the DDT campaign, and 30 years of the most intensively developed pest control industry in history, settles into the dark and waits. The bug is exactly where it has always been. It has always been good at this. It has had an extremely long time to practice,